Hi, folks, and welcome to another edition of Government Matters here on Focus Springfield. This is the first of several programs that's going to discuss something that is literally on everyone's lips these days, the housing crisis. And it's just not a housing crisis in the greater Springfield area, it's a housing crisis in all of the Commonwealth. And for this initial program, we're going to sort of be pretty broad in trying to define what's happening, to define what people are facing these days. And this isn't just about buying a home. This is about renting an apartment. This is about workforce housing, market rate housing, affordable housing, and what the current status of those three kinds of housing are, both buying a house, renting. With me today are three people who know a whole lot about this subject. Sitting next to me is Keith Fairey. He is the CEO and president of WayFinders. We have two members of the Donahue Institute at the University of Massachusetts, Kerry Spitzer and Mark Melnick. Mark is the Director of Economics and Public Policies Research, and Kerry is the Research Manager. Keith, first of all, can you tell us a little bit about WayFinders and what it does here in Western Massachusetts?
Sure. WayFinders is a nonprofit organization that works across the housing continuum from homelessness to homeownership. We work to help people who are struggling with housing stability by providing things like rental assistance. We help people who are struggling against eviction to provide emergency rental assistance, but we also help people find their way to homeownership through homeownership education programs and other supports that we provide to people in the community. We also build, develop, and manage affordable housing throughout the region. Today, we have 23 different projects throughout Western Massachusetts, providing housing to over 800 families. And so we are a pretty comprehensive organization, and we see the housing crisis from various levels, providing programs and services to support people, and also by providing housing.
From your perspective, just to set the table here a bit, how serious is our housing problem?
Our housing problem is serious. I've been the CEO of WayFinders for about 3.5 years now, and the challenge has kind of grown and in many ways snowballed over time in this very short period. Obviously, at the beginning of my tenure was at the beginning of COVID, and there was lots of talk about kind of keeping people housed, preventing evictions, and we saw an outpouring of resources from the federal government, from the state government to do that. By this time, we would have expected to see demand for those resources to go down. We have a program in particular that we run for emergency financial assistance for homeowners and renters. We're seeing the highest application volume that we've seen in my entire 3.5 years, meaning even more than in COVID when people were being put out of jobs and other things. We get 700 applications a week some weeks. These are people who can no longer afford to pay the rent or afford to pay the mortgage or can't pay their utility bills because of the kind of economic challenges that they're facing today in the housing market. So I would say that our housing challenges are real and enduring and in some cases growing for some populations.
A talking point that I've heard repeated from various politicians is we're 17,000 units of housing short in Western Massachusetts. Is that a correct talking point?
It's a correct talking point to talk about our housing supply shortage. There's a couple of different data points that people are referring to there and probably blending them together. We did some great work with the UMass Donahue Institute and published a two-phase housing study. What we looked at is both the housing supply gap in the region, which when we first released the study, the housing supply gap was projected at in 2021 at about 11,000 units and projected to grow to 19,000 units by 2025. And then we also looked at the affordability need, and that's where the 17,000 comes from. There was a need for, in terms of looking at across the Pioneer Valley, looking at the need for units that cost $500 or less. Right, so that in terms of affordability for people, that's what people needed to have affordable housing, and there's a demand for 17,000 plus units there. So there's a few different numbers bouncing around, but what all those numbers say is that we don't have the housing that we need for our population, and we don't have enough affordable housing for people who have the lowest incomes.
And if I can piggyback off of what Keith was saying there too, and part of it is a question of like almost like musical chairs when it comes to a housing market, because people with income are able to find housing, but the 17,000 statistic, 17,000 units of at $500 or less really speaks a lot about how hard it is for folks with modest means in order to find adequate housing, because they'll end up being squeezed out by folks with higher income. So it's a twofold problem. It's one about incomes in the region, but also one about available housing for modest income households.
This is an interesting point that you bring up, because when we look at Springfield, Holyoke, Westfield, Chicopee, they're all gateway cities, which means we have significant issues with poverty. We have significant issues with low incomes. And it's obvious that our housing needs and our housing problems are in lockstep with things like employment, income, what people see as their future. So let me ask the two of you, the research that you folks are doing at the Donahue Institute, is Western Mass any worse off than other parts of the Commonwealth? Or is this sort of the same across the Commonwealth? How does that work out?
So it's a little bit of both. I think that one of the things that you're highlighting really well there is the challenge across the income spectrum, but in particular the challenges for low and moderate income folks, right? So, when you look at some indicators about the housing market in Greater Springfield, the costs are different than other parts of the state. It is housing is less expensive in Greater Springfield than, say, compared to Eastern Massachusetts and Greater Boston. But that doesn't mean the challenge doesn't exist, because there are two parts of affordability. There is how much something costs, and there's how much disposable income you have to buy that something, right? And when we look at this region in particular, the makeup of industries in Greater Springfield and in the Pioneer Valley really tilts to lower wage sectors. So you end up with a lot of challenges where, hey, on the sticker price, when you compare it I live in Eastern Massachusetts, the sticker price doesn't look that bad. But when you compare it to the median household incomes, I think the median household income in Greater Springfield, Kerry, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's about $15,000 or $20,000 below the state. Well, when you take that into account, it's like, well, that ends up leading to a higher concentration of households who are spending more of their income on housing. So and I think to kind of get at the housing crisis a little bit more, when Keith was talking, we've been looking at this issue in Massachusetts for a long time. And I think what's been interesting is that some of the shocks that we've seen in the marketplace only further highlight the challenges and how precarious making ends meet are for low and moderate income households. So, pre-COVID, we were talking at the Donahue Institute about a tale of two states, where Massachusetts had an economy that was enviable compared to most states in the country. We have high tech and bio and all these exciting things that are happening with the most well-educated workforce in the nation. But those experiences are not evenly felt racially or geographically. But then when you introduce a shock to the marketplace, like COVID, it shows that precariousness for some households, particularly renters, that when the economy has a shock, what does that mean to those populations? And the government did a lot of things to try to keep people housed, but then you add inflation in the recovery period. And again, for low and moderate income folks, if more of your income is going to paying for your basic food and these kinds of things, there's less to afford other things like housing, and really puts people in a precarious position. So I think when we think about the region itself, the stories around Massachusetts, because we have underproduced housing in Massachusetts for decades. But the unique part of the Pioneer Valley includes the makeup of industries and the number of gateway cities in the region that really underscores some of the challenges for low, moderate income folks and households of color.
Kerry, I'm going to ask you, since I have a feeling with your job, you've put together this stuff. Yeah. We have two slides that the Donahue Institute has given us for this broadcast, and one is talking about housing cost burdened households in Hampden County, spending 30% or more of income on housing costs. Now, being a geezer, I'm trying to remember that when I graduated from college, there was some formula about how much money you should be spending on, how much income you should be spending on housing. I don't remember it being 30% or more back in the day, but here, according to what you've given us, in terms of renters, 58% of the people in Hampden County are spending more than 30%, 30% or more on their income for rent, as opposed to 53% in Massachusetts and 52% across the United States. This is not good, is it?
No, it's not. And I want to just point to the fact that this concept of cost burden comes from HUD, from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. So it's not something that the Donahue made up, but it's a measure from the federal government on what they would consider, an appropriate amount of your income to go towards housing. So there's cost burden, which is over 30%, and then there's also this concept of extreme cost burden, which is when you're spending more than half of your income on rent. And the issue here is that, just getting back to this idea, it's you have a limited set of income, and even after housing, you need to have money left over to pay for education, to pay for transportation, all of these other things that you need. And so as housing makes up a larger share of folks' expenses, it means they have less money left over for other important things. So even though housing in the Pioneer Valley, in Springfield and Hampden County is less expensive than, our rents are lower, home prices are lower in this area, because our incomes don't keep up with greater Boston area, we're seeing higher shares of cost burden. So that's what we're seeing here. And, it's an issue both for renters and for homeowners. And if you wanted to look at these numbers and break it down, what you're going to see is that across incomes, this is an issue, but it's particularly acute for folks at the lower end of the income spectrum. And also we see disparities when we look at these numbers by race. So we see that Black, Latino, Hispanic communities have higher shares of cost burden as well, both among renters and homeowners.
If I can add something to this too, one of the things, and for the graphics we were sharing, we wanted to keep them kind of simple for for this presentation, but one thing that stood out to me recently is also the degree to which housing burden has gone up for renters. The nice thing for homeowners, your mortgage freezes in time, right? You make an agreement with the bank and you pay that for a long time. So you'll see these changes over time where during the Great Recession, for example, homeowners and renters both had elevated cost burdens, right? And it makes sense, the economy was bad. But as the economy recovered, one of the really stark things is that cost burden for homeowners goes down, but it goes up for renters, and it continues to go up, right? So, and then in this environment right now, with high interest rates and low inventory, you have more people competing in the rental market space. So that's where you end up seeing some of the data points that Kerry was just talking to, where we see this elevated amount of housing burden for folks who are renters. And, typically renters have lower incomes or younger people. But, this problem has only gotten worse over time.
Keith, do you have a sense at WayFinders about average rents in this area? What people are facing in terms of a monthly fee to live in an apartment?
Well, what we're seeing is a lot more of people who are suffering from extreme cost burdens, so paying more than 50% of their income. And then the other thing that we're seeing is a big challenge for folks when they add another major cost that we see in our region, which is transportation. We do not have the best public transportation, so people often, if they're able to, they're trying to afford cars and insurance, and those costs have all gone up and continue to be persistently high and growing. And at the same time, what we've seen and what we saw throughout the pandemic, and there's been some interesting research done not only by the Donahue Institute on this, but Mass Housing Partnership, is that we saw rising rents during the pandemic, the heart of the pandemic, and they continue to rise. So whereas Mark was just talking about a mortgage payment is kind of fixed. Once you enter it, unless you have an adjustable rate mortgage, you're kind of fixed where you're expecting. And so for renters, though, what we're seeing on lease renewals and other things, and we have that constantly people coming to the office and seeing significant increases in rent. And so we're not talking about $10, we're talking about $100, $200, $500 increases on rent renewals. And landlords can afford to do this right now because housing is in such short supply. We came through the pandemic with a very low vacancy rate, historically low for this region. We're talking about the numbers that were in our study a couple of years ago with the Donahue Institute. We're talking about for ownership housing, our rental was around 1%, and for rental housing, it was around the 4 or 5%. When you get below that 5%, you're getting to a very tight market. Historically, though, for rental housing, it had been upwards of anywhere pre-pandemic 7, 8%. And so there's a lot more slack, a lot more options for renters out there. So not only are costs going up, there are fewer options, and people are being kind of, if they want to stay housed, they're being forced to pay more of their income for rent. So we see that every day, and people coming to us, both searching for housing that's more affordable or trying to stay in their homes and looking for assistance in getting their rent paid.
Is there particular economic factors that's driving these increases in rental costs?
Well, I think some landlords would say yes, it's costing them more to operate the buildings. If they're including utilities in their rent, their utility costs to the landlord have certainly gone up over time. It is costing more to staff buildings and keep them maintained. It's costing more to repair and improve buildings. We see this as an owner and manager ourselves. So not only do we provide these programs, but we own and manage housing. And so, and all those costs have gone up significantly for us. And so, as an owner who has an interest in keeping people housed and keeping it affordable, we try to manage those costs as best we can. If you're an owner who's gone into this to actually make a lot of money and maybe are highly leveraged, meaning you've taken out a lot of loans and other things that anticipated a certain income, and you may be compelled by that economic situation to start to raise rents to be able to afford it and be able to pay back your debts and make the profit that you were expecting to make. So these are all dynamics that are going on the ownership side that are driving up rents and impacting our renters.
The other side of this first graph we're looking at talks about owner occupied with a mortgage. In other words, the housing cost burden for people who have bought a home. Mm-hmm. And again, it's at 28% for the United States, 30% for the rest of Massachusetts, but 35% for Hampden County. What are the factors that's driving that disparity in terms of numbers?
Hampden County does have higher home prices than the average in the United States, but not for the state overall. So again, it's all about the relationship to the income to the cost of housing. And here it's things that, what goes into this calculation. It's not just the mortgage, it's also property taxes, it's utilities, it's all of these things that you need to maintain housing. So.
Okay. Yeah, for a long time, again, anecdotally, what you hear is that we're an expensive state to live in. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of factors that add into that, from utility costs to, Keith, as you mentioned, transportation. We don't have the kind of infrastructure for mass transit that the eastern part of the state, some parts of the eastern part of the state, I should say some parts, have. And that these are factors that add up. The other graph that I've got here is borderline frightening to me. It's building permits per 1,000 residents by state from 2022, and we're ninth from the bottom. Can you folks discuss a little bit of why that is happening? It's like there's obviously a demand. So I'm assuming somebody can make some money off of building houses. It doesn't look, though, by tracking building permits that's happening. So why is this happening?
Well, I think there are a lot of factors that go into it, but one of the biggest ones is zoning. And so you need to consider, each town in the Commonwealth has its own, policies on terms of what you can build, where you can build it, density, and all of those things. And in Massachusetts, we tend to have stricter zoning than places like, Florida or Texas. And in a lot of ways, that brings, a certain quality of life that can be, something we value, but it does come with a cost, which is that it reduces the construction of housing because it adds on, restrictions on where you can build and what types of housing. So, one of the biggest, phrases you might hear thrown around a lot here is NIMBYism, or not in my backyard. And I think, we have a lot of local community control, and that is positive in a lot of ways, but it can also be negative. And sometimes folks will oppose the development of housing in their communities, for whatever reasons. It's often complex, but that contributes to kind of keeping our rates of construction lower than you'd see in the rest of the country. I'd also say, Massachusetts is a small state, an older state, so we have developed a lot of the developable land in our state. So that's also an issue.
Yeah, I'll joke a lot that we'll talk about a housing crisis and the policy interventions, but we're really dealing not with one state. We're dealing with 351 political bodies. So each one of these communities, either dealing through their own zoning, as Kerry's mentioned, or whatever kind of local debate may be taking place, it definitely hamstrings a little bit of the process when it comes to building housing. And then, of course, there are, different things within that zoning, whether it's, limits to how tall buildings can be or the size of lots and this kind of stuff that really, especially in suburban areas, limits just the number of units that can be built. The state's done some things in this place to try to encourage more housing production, especially in areas that are close to public transit in the eastern part of the state. But yeah, it's been a long history of underproduction. And so that's where the housing crisis really has, some simple explanations just around supply and demand, where we just have not the supply has not kept up with the demand.
Yeah.
So I was going to turn to you and say, what kind of challenges or local resistance even has WayFinders encountered when you're trying to get some housing units built?
All kinds. So we, as I mentioned before, we are a developer and manager of affordable housing, and we find, as Mark mentioned, there's 351 cities and towns in Western Massachusetts. In the 4 counties of Western Massachusetts, there are 101 cities and towns. One of the big challenges there that we face is that there capacity at the local government level. There are some towns that don't have a full-time planner on staff, for example. There are some that are operated through town meeting, and other bodies that are really representative, but sometimes can be inefficient for moving processes quickly. And why does this matter? So people would say, well, why do we need to move quickly? Well, we have a real need to create the housing that our communities and our people need to be able to not only maintain our population, but to grow our population. And that's important because our population is aging here in Western Massachusetts. And we've seen some population decline as well. And that's interesting when we juxtapose that to the housing shortages that we have. But that's because we have people aging and living longer, staying in their homes. In previous generations, those homes would have been freed up for younger families. I mean, we have a huge demographic bubble coming in millennial generations where they're starting new households and looking for more housing. And so if we want to both retain those families in our region and have adequate housing for those who want to kind of age in our region, we need to create more housing options. A lot of communities are not looking at that. They're looking backwards when they're thinking about their communities and trying to preserve community character is often brought up as a point of resistance. Well, if you put those that apartment building here or build those townhomes there, it will somehow change the community character. I would say our community character has been evolving always. People have always been building, been adding things to communities to meet the needs of those communities. And we need to think thoughtfully. There's great opportunities that the Commonwealth has put forward that cities and towns in Western Massachusetts can take advantage of. We're building, we just got approved for some funding to build housing in South Hadley. And that is being enabled in part by the town had chosen to put a special zoning district called a 40R district, and they get actually incentives from the state in order to be able to do that, to create higher density in a town center. And so they had the willingness and the wisdom to do that, knowing that they were needing to create more housing options for people in that community. And so we're building what's called a mixed income housing development there. Some deeply affordable units, some workforce units, and then some market rate units. And it kind of what most communities have, kind of that mixed income, right? You need people at all those levels. And so I think there's been a lot of resistance to affordable housing because people don't understand what it is. It's housing that people can afford at whatever incomes that they're at, right? We all want affordable housing, whether you're have a six-figure income, which would be high for our region, above median income, or you're below that. Everyone's looking for something that they can afford that is below that 30% of your income. That's what HUD defines as affordable, and I think that's what most of us would feel as affordable in our pocketbook. So I think there needs to be, we're seeing some communities step up and do things like create these kind of districts to create more housing and meet the needs of their communities. South Hadley also just created a housing production plan that the town voted in to create 300 more units to meet the needs of people in South Hadley. I think for the moment, the final thing I'll say about this is 351 cities and towns is difficult. 101 cities and towns is difficult because these are regional problems. And as much as a community like South Hadley is doing, or Springfield or Holyoke or any of these trying to do to encourage more housing, these are regional problems. These are regional housing markets. And the lack of a regional body to kind of support, encourage, incentivize, fund these things puts a check on solutions. So there's one of the things that has also gone up during this period during COVID is the cost of construction. The project in South Hadley and one in Holyoke that we also just got funded, they were actually funded. And then the cost of construction escalated with inflation. And so we had to go back to the state to get more resources. So time and deliberation on permitting and all that really is money in housing development. And then just the fact that these cities and towns, while the state is chipping in most of the resources, there's not much at the local level to support projects often. And so, but if you had a regional body that was aggregating more of those resources, you could fund more of these projects and get them done more quickly.
A couple things. How about supply chain issues? Has that affected WayFinders in terms of completing some of these projects or moving these projects along? Because I know there are supply chain issues in the construction trades still.
Yes, particularly in the electrical components and things that we need to build housing. We're building a project right now. We're in construction on a project in Agawam, 62 units, mixed income project. And the project, the physical buildings it's townhome style development. All the townhomes are built and constructed. This winter, we had a plan to do a lot of the interior work, which we're continuing on. But our plan was to get our electrical installed, and we couldn't because the meters weren't available, the transformers and other things like that, and all the other things in the electrical supply chain were delayed. So we had to incur $250,000 to bring in temporary heat to be able to heat those buildings so that we could keep construction moving.
Sure.
And so those are the kind of impacts that those supply chains have on projects. And so we just don't kind of create the $250,000. That means we've got to find it in the budget. Something less gets done here. Somebody has to negotiate something here. So it becomes a real challenge in terms of being able to move projects forward with those supply chain issues.
I want to ask a question. Again, this is like the 17,000 housing unit. This is a talking point thing that you hear a lot of people repeat. There's a lot of people in our part of the state who look at Worcester and say, oh my God, the extension of the MBTA service to Worcester has spurred additional housing, especially in downtown. How much does transportation issues, in your viewpoint, affect housing issues? Is there a real link between the two?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in my, real estate economics class, all of the models were all about the cost of, transportation driving, to city centers, driving the cost of housing. So I think there is a fundamental link between transportation and housing. And I think, it gets to the point that like housing, the reason I'm interested in housing is not because I'm interested in the buildings, but it's because of the people who live in them, and they need to have access, where you live determines your access to employment. It determines your access to healthcare. It determines your access to good schools and education, clean air. All of these things are driven by where you live. And one of those big things is, the ability to move around and access those opportunities. And so there's also a push right now for transit-oriented development, which is the idea that, both environmentally it's a good idea, and then it's also a good idea for, accessing opportunity to make sure that people are living in a place where they can access all of those, items I just listed.
Yeah, and I think, there's a variety of things within this. And I'm glad Kerry talked about the opportunity stuff. That was a big part of that. The second study we did with WayFinders is talking about the role that place plays in access to opportunity for folks. And I think that was one of the my driving interests in the study was taking a look at we were talking about the Pioneer Valley, which is pretty large, and it's an interesting mix of urban, exurban, suburban, rural, and what the access to opportunity looks like in a place where the transportation, where there isn't universal transportation, and where you need a car in a lot of different places, right? So I think the two things that kind of stand out to me when thinking about transportation here is, like, one, there's the I felt like you were driving towards like an east-west rail thing there when you started talking about.
Oh, I'm just about to say that. Go ahead.
Yeah. But there's this part. But then I also think about like interregional transportation. Like east-west rail is a really big concept, and I think there are parts of it that are a great idea, but there are parts of it that I think are going to be a massive engineering challenge, just in terms of time, getting from one point to the other. Whereas I feel like interregional, and I mean, I love to hear what Keith and Kerry have to say about this, but like in terms of interregional, I feel like that's the bigger issue to solve, like where it's easier to get from points, a little further flung, because that's where the challenge comes in for low and moderate income folks, is that you might not have a car, you might not be able to afford a car, but the only home you can afford is further away from where the job center is. And then how are you going to get to work, right? So things like having reliable bus service, that reaches out into different locations is important, and making sure that there are opportunities in other places, right? Economic opportunities. So I think East-West Rail can be an exciting concept, but I do think that there's some blocking and tackling stuff that is maybe easier to achieve, but it isn't quite as sexy. But is probably more impacting the everyday lives of folks in the region.
Well, let's just use this example. You're building this complex in Agawam. Let's say one of the tenants has got a job at MGM, which is right over that wall there. So if they don't have a car, then they have to rely on bus transportation. And the question is there adequate bus transportation, which brings back to your point, from a community like Agawam, which is not that far away from downtown Springfield by any means. But if you don't have a car, you might as well be in Tierra del Fuego. I mean, it's going to be really tough. And I'm just wondering, in these discussions about housing, how much we need bus service from point A to point B so people can find a house in one community, but they may have a job in another community. How important is that?
It's very important. I think as a developer of housing, we're looking when we're locating housing, we're looking to see if there are transportation connections there. It's certainly encouraged for us, because we know that the isolation that can cause for folks. And we know that there is, as Mark was saying, East-West Rail is a wonderful concept, lots of engineering challenges and other things to make the rail work. But we have the roads. We have buses already. We need more routes. We need more routes at different times of day. Those things are a much lower bar in terms of costs, and will unlock a whole lot more opportunity in a much quicker fashion. Some of the challenge we face with transportation is also is having a lot of small regional transit agencies. Actually, Pioneer Valley Transit Authority is really just serving Hampden and Hampshire County. It doesn't serve Franklin County. They have their own Franklin Regional Transit, and there's hard to make connections between the two. even though that's necessary for people who live in those communities. So we really need to be thinking outside the box, and I know the transit agencies are. They recently got some more funding, and they're looking at trying to expand their connections so that you can travel more easily throughout Western Massachusetts. Again, it's a regional housing market, it's a regional economy, it's a regional job market, and we need to create a better and easier way for people to flow between those. In fact, I was talking with the Pioneer Valley Transit Authority president the other day, and she said to me, "I know Wayfinders," and I was kind of surprised. Why do you know us? And she knew us because we buy so many bus passes. Who do we buy bus passes for? For homeless families who are trying to find housing and get stabilized and find jobs to move out of our homeless shelters. And so we buy so many of those passes, they know who we are as a housing organization. But we also know that those bus passes aren't going to work if somebody's looking for a second shift job or a third shift job because the buses aren't running them. And that means either people are walking or figuring out some other way if they don't have a car to get there. And those can be really challenging if you have kids at home or other challenges, mobility challenges of your own, just moving around. So the need to have that kind of a dual investment here in housing and transportation for our region is really what can unlock a lot of economic opportunity.
In pre-pandemic, this was a lot of the conversation around the state. I know we're focused on Greater Springfield and the Pioneer Valley in this conversation, but I live in the eastern part of the state, and these were the exact challenges that we were talking about in the Greater Boston market as well, because what is affordable continues to stretch out further and further, and then it leads to these miserable commutes. And my wife and I, we used to live in Jamaica Plain. We had 2 kids. We needed a bigger place. We started looking in suburban communities around Boston, couldn't afford the first ring, so ended up in Natick, which is on the commuter rail line. But if I drive on the Pike, like when I'm driving up to 90, it's a standstill at 7 o'clock in the morning still, post-pandemic, post-work from home, right? But a lot of this is just that pressure point on the combination of transportation and housing. And then you have more cars on the road in eastern Massachusetts because it's not close to transit for where modest income folks are living. And then you can see the same things happening out here as well. So it's as Kerry was saying, the economics of it, if you have good transportation access, that home tends to cost more. But then so the folks who need to have that better access or that can't afford the homes in those areas. So it's really a catch-22.
I also wanted to mention, Mike, sort of about the population and sort of people. The discussion has been a lot. The governor ran on people leaving Massachusetts because of the lack of competitiveness, lack of affordability here in Massachusetts, and as we look at that, what was the data point that kind of stirred the pot around that? Well, one of the data points was looking at the 2020 census and seeing a drop of just shy of 50,000 people left Massachusetts, right? So beginning to going below that 7 million mark and kind of, and so that's significant. Why does that matter? That matters in a lot of ways if that continues. That can matter in terms of congressional representation. It can matter in per capita resources we actually get back from the federal government. One of those is a low-income housing tax credit that helps us build housing. We get less of those now because of that data point. But the other, on the bright side of things, especially looking at Western Massachusetts, you mentioned our gateway cities. So it got me kind of scratching your head. 50,000 or so people lost. When I looked at the 26 or so gateway cities that we have here in Western Massachusetts, 11 of them are below their peak population. Of the top 6, 4 of them are in Western Massachusetts. If we were to bring those back up to full capacity, a city like Holyoke that was about 60,000 people today is 37,000 people or so, we would be over 60,000 people to the good, right? So we would more than fill that loss that we were talking about. And there's room to grow there. These are places already with infrastructure. A city like Holyoke has its own utility. The Holyoke Gas and Electric, right? The streets are there. The buildings are even there in many cases, right? We just need to invest and have a long-term investment plan that is both supported by the state, and that's why, at least at WayFinders and my colleagues in housing throughout the state are excited about what the governor is putting forward in the Affordable Homes Act, $4.1 billion investment in our housing stock. But we need to make those investments at every level. Locally, our local communities need to be thinking about what kind of future they want to have for their communities. What do they want their communities to continue to shrink? Do they want their schools to continue to shrink? Do they want to see the loss of services like hospitals and maternity wards and all those things? That's what happens with population decline. Okay, and that makes your community less competitive. But if we invest, if we create the more opportunity for investment by creating the right zoning for housing development, we can take advantage of our room to grow and really have a thriving region overall. And that's why we're so excited about doing more housing development, not just providing the programs, but trying to create more opportunity in all types of communities, suburban, urban, rural communities. There's room to grow here in Western Mass.
So I'd like to jump in on this because Keith was touched on this a little while ago, and then the topic changed. But I want to linger a little bit more on this population shifts and what it means for the state and its competitiveness. On the surface, there appears almost like this contradiction, right? Where it's like you have a lot of public policymakers expressing concern about domestic outmigration in the state, and that's what Keith was alluding to. Is that in Massachusetts we've been growing population pretty steadily over the last several decades. But a lot of that population increase was because of the attraction of foreign-born residents to the region, because we would lose a lot of folks to domestic outmigration. Well, during the pandemic, one of the things that happened was we had almost no immigration, right? And then we had a significant increase in domestic outmigration, and it caused a lot of concern about, hey, where are these people going? Why are they leaving? Well, someone could say, well, who cares? We have a housing crisis. If people started leaving, we'd end up, then this would help bring down the housing prices. But that's not the right way to think about this on a number of fronts. One is our household formation in the state is just looking different. So when Keith was mentioning before about an older population, we need to have a housing stock that is responsive to an older population. In 2020, 14% of Massachusetts was 65 or over. We projected the Donahue Institute by 2050, about 27% of Massachusetts will be 65 or over. So what that means is a stagnating labor force growth in the state, because we're talking about significant population growth in our oldest cohorts. In some parts of the state, we'd have a decline in workers. Pioneer Valley would be kind of flat, but if you look at a place like Fitchburg in the north central region, they'd actually have a decline in their total number of workers in the region. But you're going to have services that are needed too at the very same time, because of people being able to age in place, home health aides, these kinds of things. So what are the right kind of homes for smaller households and older households? So that's one of the reasons why we have to respond with different kinds of housing across the age continuum, the income continuum, because what it took to house a population in Massachusetts in 1950 is not going to be the same in 2050. And so that's why you need to build, even in a scenario, and why we need to attract workers into our region, because our workforce is going to shrink and our workforce is going to flatline, and we're not going to have the workers available to come fill in these critical job vacancies. Really interestingly, too, when we saw this domestic outmigration, was this question of who's leaving. And why are they leaving?
I just was going to ask you, in terms of demographic groups, who is leaving?
Yeah, and who's leaving. And so, initially, I think people try to use it as a political cudgel a bit to be like, oh, it's the millionaire's tax. It's like, well, we don't even have the millionaire's tax yet with these data, so that's not what we're seeing. And so so at the Donahue Institute, we dug in a little bit to look a bit about at the demographics. And Kerry is one of the leaders on that project. Kerry, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, a lot of folks assume it's also, folks retiring, moving south, and that's some of it, but it's actually a lot of folks who are kind of in that 25 to 54, prime working age group who are leaving the state. And we think it might be, and again, this is all, we don't have randomized controlled trials or anything, so this is all, us trying to make sense of the data. But what we're thinking is, it's like when you're coming up to that stage of forming your own household, if you can't afford housing, it's going to drive folks out. And I think if you go back to that slide where we were looking at the housing production, a lot of the key states that people are moving to are on the other side of us. So, Florida is one of the top destinations. Other states are places like New Hampshire and Connecticut, which are closer, and people clearly, have social ties, and they may be, reluctant to leave New England. But it's a lot of these folks who I think we'd love to, hold on to all of the folks who move to the area for the higher education opportunities. If we could find a way to kind of keep more of those folks in the state, that would be a real boon.
Yeah, and then especially mentioning, Kerry mentions the 25 to 54 age group. If you zero in even a little bit more, it's that 25 to 34 group.
Yeah.
That's a huge on the net loss. Now, part of this is because it's age groups that are able to be more mobile, right? I'm in my mid 40s now. I own a home. I have 2 kids in public schools. It's tougher to move than if we had done this 15 years ago, right? But at the same time, it's the ability to start your life, right? And so here's an age group who we see significant out migration. And so thinking about competitive ways that we can attract and retain folks to our state are going to be important for growing our economy. And a big part of that is having affordable housing and job opportunities for residents. So I think, when the economic development plan for the state just came out, they're talking competitiveness. I'm thinking largely housing. Like, how is it that you can, 2 main things on that: housing and attracting and retaining people, making it easier for people to establish their lives, especially low and moderate income folks, to stay in the state. The second, which is different than this conversation, but still important nonetheless, is trying to find ways to goose labor force participation in populations that don't participate at high levels. Because we have a lot of folks in Massachusetts who have talent, but there's something blocking their access to the labor market. Thinking of folks with a criminal record, for example. Some mistake you make as a teen can continue to hang around your neck for the rest of your life, right? And it's like, can we deal with those kinds of issues so that those folks can work at their highest and best potential? Folks with disabilities, veterans. These are all populations with low labor force participation. And if we invest in this population, then their earnings can go up. They can access different things, and they can plug into the labor market where we have significant needs. So for me, when we talk about like the challenges in Massachusetts over the next 10, 20 years, those are the things that I focus on a bunch, because we are going to need labor. And in order to have labor, we need to have the things that households need to survive. And so it's a very short walk to housing at that point. And that to me is really one of and I'm excited that the governor and the new administration has put so much focus on housing, because it's central to growing the state.
Yeah, I think so. As we go back again to the governor is taking action. The governor is challenging her colleague in the legislature to join her in that action. But we also need every city and town to be part of that. And the question I ask everyone is, what do you want your community to look like in the future? When you think about it from an economic and a socially kind of competitiveness and thriving community, we need to invest in our communities. We need to understand that those communities, their populations are changing. They're aging. There's a need for different housing types. And you have an opportunity in your communities to actually create that future that can make your community thrive. Sitting on our hands and saying we're not going to create any more housing or blocking housing that comes in. Sure, housing projects can be made better. We're not all the best at saying that, but just blocking housing, and we're making it take longer. We'll make it cost more. We'll delay our ability to make investments in communities. And will delay our ability and may thwart our ability to have kind of economically diverse and thriving communities. So there's an opportunity for us all right now to take action on that. You can get involved locally with your local town. When housing is on the agenda, show up for housing. Find out what's going on. Support those housing projects. Think about who's going to live there, who could live there. How do these people integrate into our town? What about our teachers? What about the folks who work in our shops? What about our firefighters and nurses? All these jobs are in high demand. We're having a hard time filling these positions throughout our region. We need to create affordable places for those folks to live. This is all part of the kind of the continuum of housing that we need in our community. And so you can be part of that by just coming up and showing up and saying, yes, we want housing. Often at meetings locally, it's a few people who are very loud people sometimes who are opposing them for the not in my backyard reasons of community character and other things like that. And I think there's a much more understanding and impacted community that needs to show up to support creating more housing options in our communities. And our local elected officials have a role to play in that, our city councilors, our town councilors, and so on. Thinking about you're not only managing the town or the city for today, but for the future. And thinking about what investments are needed to not only keep it the way it is, but more than that, grow it. And grow it to adapt to the future that is the demographics that Mark was talking about and Kerry are talking about are upon us, and they're going to continue to grow in this trend. So how do we create those communities for the future? I think that's a challenge for us all, and that's a challenge for us all to show up to every day in our communities.
I want to swing back to a topic, and we really haven't talked a lot about this, but part of the housing crisis revolves around people who find themselves homeless. There was pre-pandemic a huge push in the city of Springfield to quote unquote cure homelessness. And there was a huge thrust and effort to take people who are homeless and to get them into apartments, get them into living situations that are far more stable and productive than being in the shelter system. Lots of publicity about that, a lot of effort about that, and now you don't hear practically anything about homelessness in the city. So I'll start off with you, Keith. Is homelessness cured in the greater Springfield area, in your opinion? And then we can switch over
Sure.
to state figures about this.
Well, I would say no, unequivocally. And Massachusetts is a unique state in some very good ways. One of the things is for families, we're a right to shelter state. So if you are an adult and you have a dependent child and you are homeless as deemed by the state, then the state will has a right to shelter. Now, that right to shelter was just recently suspended with a emergency declaration by the governor because of the surge of migrants coming to Massachusetts from border states that have the shelter system at well above capacity. Some 7,500 households now currently being housed. Some domestic born from here in the Commonwealth, and then many new arrivals. So no, we haven't solved it for families. We haven't solved it for individuals. And I think one of the things that, during the pandemic, we were doing some great things around trying to prevent people from becoming homeless, trying to prevent evictions. There was unprecedented federal support and state support for that, from a resources standpoint and from a policy standpoint. Some of those resources and policies have changed over time, but the state is still investing heavily in trying to keep people from becoming homeless, despite the economic headwinds for some families. So I would say no, homelessness is not by any means solved. The kind of housing you're talking about, the kind of housing first approach where you really just try to meet people's housing needs, and then if they have other challenges they're working with, substance use disorder or mental health or other things, you try to provide that afterwards. You don't make that as a threshold issue. Those are all good things, but it's about building housing and providing money for services there, and we're not building enough of that housing. So we haven't solved it. The solution to homelessness is housing, no doubt about that. But it's caught in the mix of all this larger housing conversation that we're having about not having enough housing starts, not building enough diverse housing types, especially for folks who are in high need and trying to kind of rebuild their lives and create housing stability. So no, it's still very much here, very much a real thing. Today, our organization has 278 families in shelter. It's very difficult for those families to move out and find placements. We have caseworkers and others working with them. There are unprecedented resources now available to them to try to transition out, but finding affordable housing in the community is the biggest challenge. There just aren't enough units that they can afford. That going back to where we started at the $500 affordability or less, that means you need a subsidized unit. There are really no units that are $500 or less out there. You need subsidies to afford that, rental assistance payments and other subsidies, and they're there, but now the housing units aren't even there. If you have one, we have people with rental vouchers who are searching for months. They can't find one. And guess what? In certain vouchers, especially federal vouchers, you run out of time. You time out. So here you got your golden ticket to housing stability, and you can't find the housing unit because it doesn't exist, right? That you can afford. You can't find it. And so that's the kind of how all this discussion integrates from the very beginning, where we started around that 17,000 number you're asking about, to the lack of permitting for housing, to this very issue of homelessness. The people who have the least are struggling the most right now.
Do we see the same type of situation statewide at this point, do you think?
I believe so. I mean, the fact is that homelessness has been up across the nation, actually, in the past. If you look every year, there's an annual statistics that come out at the federal level, and if you look at those statistics, homelessness is up across the board. And I think that is related to everything we've been talking about right now, which is that housing costs are up across the country. And it really is there are a lot of things that go into homelessness, but I think you can't, separate it from being a housing issue. It really is in places where housing costs less, you'll see lower rates of homelessness. There's an association, definitely, among those indicators. So I think it's really important to kind of. There's been some backlash against this housing first model, but I think that is really the solution. Is that like once you put somebody in permanent supportive housing, they can have access to services that will help them address if there is a substance use disorder, if there is a lack of employment or a disability, accessing resources. All of those things can get addressed when you have a stable place to live. And when you don't have that, it's just incredibly hard to address all those other issues. I think one of the interesting kind of bright spots, and when we talk about homelessness, is in veterans homelessness. There was a huge federal push to address veterans homelessness, and I think that shows how if you put the dollars there, there's something called the HUD-VASH program, which was pretty well funded and I think has had a real impact. And I think if we took that same approach federally, we could see similar outcomes for all different types of people experiencing homelessness. And I think it's much less expensive, or in most cases, it's less expensive to kind of provide housing than it is to let people continue experiencing homelessness, because they end up showing up in emergency rooms, in jails, and other aspects of the public systems that cost a lot of money. So providing housing is not inexpensive, but there are benefits and savings when you do that.
Plus the number of children who
Yeah,
are
it's-
homeless. Like, I don't know the statistics. You may be more familiar, but I mean, the number of households that are homeless is obviously, I think one of the things that get lost in the conversation is the homelessness, instability for children and going to school and having meals and this kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I think the person on the street who you often see experiencing homelessness, like usually there's a stereotypical, older male, and it's really often actually children in families who are among the largest segment of the homeless population.
Housing does not stand alone as an issue. It's part of a comprehensive look at economic issues in the state, social issues in the state. It reflects a lot of the problems and challenges that we have as a Commonwealth. But for now, I want to thank all three of you for taking the time and driving from far-flung Natick in order to talk about this here locally, because these are the types of issues that we're all facing in various forms across the state. So thank you very much for taking the time to speak about this today. Thank you very much for staying with us and for tuning in.